At the center of the square, Sheriff Duncan stood beside a wooden platform that served as both market stage and pillory, depending on the day's needs. Today, it held a man. "What's happening, Mama?" George whispered, rising on her toes to peer over the shoulders of the men in front of them. "Hush, Georgina," Marion murmured absently. The square buzzed with an ugly excitement that made her skin crawl. Even from her position at the crowd's edge, Marion could see the prisoner was enormous, tall enough that Duncan barely reached his shoulder, broad across the chest and arms despite the obvious ravages of imprisonment. Iron shackles bound his wrists, the metal dark with rust and what might have been blood. His clothes, once fine, hung in tatters that revealed more wounds than whole skin. "Behold," Duncan called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. "A northern raider, caught stealing from the king's lands. His people have 3 days to ransom him." He paused dramatically. Today marks the 3rd day. No gold has come. A murmur ran through the crowd, excitement, fear, disgust all mingled together. Marion found herself pushing forward, drawn by something she couldn't name. "The law demands restitution," Duncan continued. 6 silver coins in damages to the crown, or this man's service until the debt is paid. Who will bid? The man on the platform had not moved or spoken, but as Marion drew closer, she could see his eyes scanning the crowd with cold assessment. They were startling blue, like winter sky, and held no trace of fear. "Come now," Duncan taunted when no one immediately responded. "He's strong as an ox. Think of the work you could get from him." Not bleeding all over, Marion thought. The prisoner was swaying almost imperceptibly on his feet, fighting to remain upright. Dark stains on the platform beneath him spoke of wounds still weeping. "Aye, if he doesn't murder us in our beds," called out Willem the baker. Several people around Marion laughed and jeered. A young apprentice, emboldened by the mob's energy, picked up a stone and hurled it at the platform. It struck the prisoner's shoulder, his wounded shoulder, and this time he did flinch. The crowd roared its approval at this first sign of weakness, and Marion's hands clenched into fists at her sides. The casual cruelty, the delight they took in his degradation, it made her sick. The prisoner's eyes had found hers, and she saw dignity, pain, and a quiet defiance in those winter blue depths. 4 silver coins, Duncan announced, dropping the price when the jeering continued but no bids came. A bargain for such a strong back. Marion couldn't look away. Behind his stoic expression was a person suffering, trying to maintain his humanity while being treated like an animal. In that moment of recognition, one human acknowledging another's suffering, something stirred in Marion's heart. The healer in her couldn't stand by and watch this happen, not when she had the means to help. And there, as his torn shirt shifted with his movement, she saw his wound. Located on his left shoulder, it wasn't just bleeding. The flesh around it was wrong somehow, discolored with veins of silver black that spread like poison across his skin. She'd never seen anything like it, and she was a healer. 3 silver, then, Duncan continued, frustration creeping into his voice. He's dying, Marion realized with crystal clarity. He's standing there with his back straight and his chin up, but he's dying if no one helps him. 2 silver, Duncan announced, dropping the price. Still no takers. The crowd was content to gawk and jeer, but none wanted to actually purchase a prisoner. 20 pounds, then. Come, surely someone... I'll take him. The words fell into sudden silence like stones into still water. Marion felt every eye in the square turn to her, felt the weight of their shocked stares. "Marion," Duncan said, his voice carefully controlled, though Marion knew he must be enraged. He wanted to get rid of the prisoner, yes, but certainly not at the expense of his late brother's widow, whose money he saw as his own. 2 silver coins, Marion said, reaching into her purse with hands that trembled only slightly. "You said final offer." "Mama," George whispered, but there was excitement in her voice rather than fear. 2 silver coins is all I have anyway, Marion continued, ignoring her daughter's whispered encouragement. She pushed through the crowd toward the platform, the coins clutched in her fist. The prisoner watched her approach with something that might have been wonder flickering in those startling blue eyes. Duncan's face had gone red above his beard. "Marion, I forbid this. You cannot forbid anything." Marian said quietly, mounting the steps to the platform. She held out the coins. I claim him according to the law. For a moment, Duncan looked as though he might refuse. But they were in the market square, surrounded by witnesses, and the law was clear. He snatched the coins from her palm with barely controlled fury. "So be it," he said through gritted teeth, "but when he murders you in your sleep, don't come crying to me." Marian turned to face the prisoner. Up close, she could see the full extent of his injuries, not just the strange wound on his shoulder, but cuts and bruises that spoke of rough treatment. Yet he held himself with dignity, even in chains. "Can you walk?" she asked. His brow furrowed, and then he spoke for the first time since she'd been watching. The words were liquid and musical, completely incomprehensible to her ears. Gaelic. He was speaking Gaelic, the language of the Highland clans. Marian's blood went cold. Highland. She'd just purchased a Highland prisoner. The crowd's vicious hatred suddenly made perfect sense. This wasn't just any captured raider. This was one of the wild men from the northern clans, the people her own king had declared enemies of the realm. Highland dog, someone spat from the crowd, confirming her realization, should put him down like the rabid beast he is. Marian felt every eye in the square boring into her, felt the weight of their shocked judgment. She'd defended him without knowing what he was, and now she was committed. Her temper flared. "He's a man," she said sharply, loud enough for all to hear. "A wounded man who needs healing, not your hatred." Duncan roughly unlocked the shackles, his face twisted with disgust. "A Highland savage," he said, loud enough for the crowd to hear. "He's your problem now, Marian. Don't expect help from me when you realize your mistake." Marian ignored him, instead offering her arm to support the prisoner as he stepped down from the platform. He was even larger than she'd thought. She barely reached his shoulder, but he accepted her aid with careful dignity, murmuring something in Gaelic that might have been gratitude. "Come," she said simply, knowing he might not understand her words, but hoping her tone would convey safety. "Let's get you home." Chapter 1. The walk from the market square to Marian's cottage should have taken no more than 10 minutes. Instead, it stretched into an eternity of second-guessing and growing dread. What have I done? The question hammered through Marian's mind with each labored step. The Highland prisoner, her Highland prisoner now, leaned more heavily on her arm with each passing moment, his breathing growing increasingly ragged. And behind them, she could still feel the weight of hostile stares from the townspeople who had followed them to the edge of the square. "Mama," George chirped, practically bouncing with excitement. "Ask him if he's really been to the Great Locks. I heard the Highland Locks are so deep they have monsters in them." "George," Marian said sharply, then caught herself. "Don't speak to him." Her daughter's face fell. "But why not? He's going to be living with us, isn't he?" Marian's step faltered. Living with them. Heavens, what was she supposed to do with him? Where was he supposed to sleep? "He's not living with us," Marian said. "He's coming so I can treat his wound, nothing more." The prisoner made a sound, something between a grunt and what might have been words. "See?" George said triumphantly. "He's trying to talk to us." "George, stop!" Marian commanded. But her daughter was already moving closer to the stranger, studying his face with the fearless curiosity. "You're very tall," George informed him solemnly. "Are all Highland men so big?" The prisoner's gaze shifted to George, and something in his expression softened. He spoke again, his voice gentler this time. "George, I said don't speak to him," Marian repeated. The last thing Marian needed was for George to start romanticizing Highland warriors. They had reached the outskirts of the burg now, where the cobbled streets gave way to dirt paths and the houses grew smaller and more scattered. Marian's cottage sat at the very edge of the settlement, close enough to be part of the community but far enough away that her herb garden and the occasional strange visitor wouldn't cause too much gossip. Though there will certainly be gossip now, she thought grimly. By evening, every soul around would know that the witch woman had bought herself a Highland savage. The prisoner had grown steadily heavier against her side, and Marian could hear the harsh rasp of his breathing. "Almost there," she murmured. Just as her cottage came into view around the bend, the prisoner stopped walking. His blue eyes were fixed on the cottage, then the forest beyond it, then back to her face. She could practically see him calculating distances, the odds of making it to the tree line. He's going to run, she realized. Marian found herself stepping back, releasing his arm entirely. "You can go," she said quietly. "If that's what you want to do, go." He stared at her, clearly not understanding her words but perhaps catching something in her tone. Marian pointed toward the forest, then made a shooing motion with her hands. "Go," she repeated. "I won't stop you." The prisoner stared at her, his gaze flickering to the beckoning trees, then back to her face. Marian stepped back further, making her meaning clear. She even turned slightly toward her cottage, as if to give him privacy for his escape. Part of her, the practical, frightened part, hoped he would take the opportunity. It would solve so many problems. But as she watched him from the corner of her eye, she also felt a stab of guilt. His face had gone ashen beneath its tan, and a sheen of sweat covered his brow. "He'll die out there alone," she thought, "and I'll have let him." The prisoner straightened as much as his injuries would allow, nodded once at Marian with what might have been gratitude, then turned decisively toward the forest. On the third step toward his freedom, his knees buckled and he collapsed face first into the dirt path. "Is he dead?" she asked, rushing forward. Marian pressed her ear to his chest, relief flooding through her at the sound of a heartbeat. "No, he lives. Help me get him inside." It took both of them, with Marian taking his shoulders and George attempting to lift his feet, to drag the unconscious Highland prisoner the final few yards to her cottage door. By the time they managed to wrestle him through the doorway and onto the floor of her small front room, Marian was breathless. She knelt beside him, studying the strange wound on his shoulder in the better light that came through her windows. The silver-black discoloration had spread since she'd first seen it, creeping down his arm and across his chest like frost on glass. What manner of poison could do this, she wondered. "Mama," George's voice was small now, uncertain. "What do we do with him?" Marian looked down at the unconscious man sprawled across her floor, this Highland stranger who had somehow become her responsibility. There were old scars on his hands and arms that spoke of a warrior's life, but also calluses that suggested he was no stranger to honest work. "What have I done?" she asked herself again. But this time, as she rose to begin gathering her healing supplies, the question felt less like despair and more like determination. Whatever she had done, she was committed now, and this man, enemy or not, Highland savage or not, was going to live if she had anything to say about it. Chapter 2. Marian had dragged the unconscious Highland prisoner as close to the hearth as she dared, spreading her thickest blankets beneath him on the stone floor. By the flickering firelight, his wound looked even more sinister. She knelt beside him with her herb basket, crushing willow bark between her palms and breathing in the bitter scent. "Start with what you know," she told herself. "Treat the fever first, then the pain, then what?" She had never seen anything like this poison before. "George, I need you to gather some elderflower from the garden," she said without looking up, "and see if there's any birch bark near the old stump." "Mama," George's voice was small, "maybe you should—" "Stop," Marian interrupted. "Don't say it." "You don't know what I was going to say." Marian finally looked up at her daughter's face. "I know exactly what you were going to say, Georgina. And you know what my answer would be. Remember what we discussed?" George's shoulders sagged. "We don't talk about it," she recited. "We pretend like it doesn't exist." "Yes," Marian agreed. The word was barely a whisper. She turned back to her herbs, grinding them with unnecessary force. Some knowledge was too dangerous to acknowledge, even between mother and daughter. The hours passed in careful, methodical work. Marian brewed teas and prepared poultices, cleaned the wound with boiled water and honey, tried every remedy her grandmother had ever taught her. But the Highland prisoner remained deeply unconscious, his breathing shallow but steady. George helped without complaint, fetching water and stoking the fire, but as darkness fell beyond the cottage windows, Marian sent her daughter to bed. She herself dozed fitfully in her chair beside the hearth, starting awake every time the fire popped or the wind rattled the shutters. Suddenly sound made her eyes snap fully open. Breathing, harsh labored panting, the Highland prisoner was awake, or something like awake. Marian could see the rapid rise and fall of his chest, hear the low sounds of distress escaping his throat. "Easy," she murmured, reaching for the cup of willow bark tea she'd prepared hours ago. "You need to drink this." She slipped one arm behind his shoulders, trying to lift him enough to get the liquid past his lips. His skin was burning hot beneath her touch, and she could feel the tension in his muscles. "Please," she whispered, tilting the cup toward his mouth. "Let me help you." His eyes snapped open. Marian gasped, nearly dropping her beverage when their eyes met. Because where winter blue had been before, now blazed molten gold, something fierce and wild and utterly inhuman. "What? How are your eyes?" Before she could finish her question, his hand shot up to cup her cheek, stunning her silent. His palm was fever-hot against her skin, calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw. He spoke, voice rough with delirium, words that seemed to pour over her like honey. She couldn't understand them, but the tone was tender, wondering, as if he was seeing something miraculous. "I don't understand," Marian whispered. His golden eyes searched her face with desperate intensity. Then slowly, as if drawn by something beyond his control, he leaned closer. A half-protest formed on Marian's lips as he drew nearer, but it died when he was near enough that she could feel his breath against her skin. His nose brushed along the column of her throat, and she heard him inhale deeply, as if he was feeding on her scent alone. The sound he made then was barely human, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through his chest and into hers. "What are you?" Marian began, but the words died as his lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder. For a moment it was almost tender, almost human. Then his teeth sank deep into her flesh. Marian's scream caught in her throat, emerging as little more than a strangled gasp. Pain lanced through her, sharp and shocking and immediate, but even as she tried to pull away, his arm came around her waist, holding her against him with impossible strength. "Why aren't you moving?" her mind screamed. "He's hurting you. Fight him!" But the pain was already changing, transforming into something else entirely. Heat spread from the bite through her veins, and suddenly she couldn't tell if she was trying to escape or press closer. Her hands found his shoulders, meaning to push him away, but her fingers only curled into his shirt as unfamiliar sensations coursed through her body. She felt his tongue against her skin, warm and rough, and realized with distant shock that he was licking blood. Her blood. The knowledge sent another wave of that strange, overwhelming heat racing through her limbs. Then as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The Highland prisoner's golden eyes rolled back, and he collapsed against the blankets, unconscious once more. Marian swayed where she knelt, one hand pressed to her bleeding neck, staring down at him in shock. What just happened? She stumbled to her feet on unsteady legs, moving toward the basin of water she kept by the window. Marian wet a cloth and pressed it to the wound, wincing at the sting. The bite marks were deep but clean, already beginning to clot. They would heal, she told herself. They would heal, and she would pretend this had never happened. But even as she cleaned the blood away, she could feel something changing inside her. It started as a warmth in her chest, spreading outward like ripples in a pond. Then the warmth became heat, and the heat became fire, and suddenly her entire body felt as though it were burning from within. Marian gasped, gripping the edge of the basin as her knees threatened to give way. The pain drove her to the floor. It was as if every bone in her body was breaking and reforming, every muscle tearing and rebuilding itself. She tried to scream, but no sound emerged. Her throat locked tight against the agony. What did he do to me? She thought. The question followed her down into darkness as consciousness fled, leaving her crumpled on the floor of her own cottage, blood still staining her throat. Chapter 3. Marian woke to George shaking her shoulder frantically. "Mama! Mama, wake up! He's dying!" Marian struggled to consciousness, her body aching as if she'd been thrown from a horse. The memories came flooding back, the golden eyes, the bite, the searing pain that had driven her to darkness. Her hand flew instinctively to her neck, expecting to find torn flesh and dried blood. Instead, her fingers found skin that was whole, with only the faintest tender spots to mark where teeth had broken flesh. How is that possible, she wondered. The wound had been deep enough to bleed freely, and yet now it felt nearly healed. Did I imagine it all? She wondered. But no, the tenderness was real, and when she pressed lightly, there was an odd sensitivity that sent an unexpected shiver through her. Not pain, exactly, but something else entirely. "Mama!" George's voice brought her sharply back to the present. "Hurry!" Marian quickly arranged her hair to fall over her neck, hiding any trace of what had happened, then turned to look at the Highland prisoner by the fire. Her breath caught in her throat. George was right. He was dying. There was no other way to describe the gray pallor of his skin, the barely perceptible rise and fall of his chest. A deep, gnawing anxiety rose within her. Suddenly, the idea of him dying felt unbearable in a way that made no sense, as if something inside her was screaming that she couldn't let this happen. The panic was overwhelming, so far beyond what she should feel for any stranger that Marian was left to wonder yet again if all of this was a dream. "What do we do?" George whispered. Marian knelt beside the dying man, pressing her ear to his chest. His heartbeat was there, but so faint she could barely detect it. "Mama," George's voice was very small, "you have to do the thing." Marian's head snapped up. "What thing?" she asked. "The thing that we don't talk about," George replied. Marian gaped. "We don't talk about it for a reason, Georgina," she snapped. "You know what happens to women like us if anyone finds out." George's eyes grew wide but determined. "But he's dying, Mama," she said quietly. "And you're crying." Marian touched her cheek and was shocked to find it wet with tears. When had she started crying? For a man she barely knew, no less? She sighed, remembering her grandmother's words, spoken by candlelight. "The gift is more curse than blessing, child. It draws attention we cannot afford. Keep it hidden, always." Exposure meant death, not just for herself, but for George. But looking down at the man whose breathing grew shallower with each passing moment, Marian realized she had already made her choice. "Check the door," she said. "Make sure it's barred and close the shutters completely." Marian knelt beside the Highland prisoner and placed her hands over his wounded shoulder. She closed her eyes and reached deep within herself to the place she had kept locked away since childhood. The warmth started in her chest, just as it always had. A gentle heat that spread down her arms and into her palms. When she opened her eyes, soft light emanated from her hands, golden and pure. But the moment her magic touched his wound, Marian gasped in shock. There was something else there, something dark and malevolent that seemed to writhe away from her healing light. The poison wasn't natural. It was actively fighting her gift, trying to consume both the healing energy and the man beneath her hands. What manner of weapon could do this? But beneath the darkness, she sensed something else entirely. Power. Wild, primal energy that felt ancient and somehow familiar. It called to something deep in her soul, something that recognized it as other. Like her, but different. As her magic encountered his, there was a moment of recognition, a touching of two energies that shouldn't exist in the world of men. His power felt like wilderness and moonlight, and for just an instant, it felt like home. The dark poison seemed to recoil from their combined energies. Marian watched in fascination as the silver-black veins began to fade, retreating back toward the original wound. "You did it, Mama." George threw her arms around Marian's waist. "You saved him." Marian stared down at her hands, still glowing faintly with residual power. "Never again," she whispered, pulling George close. "Do you understand me? I can never use this gift again. It's too dangerous. If anyone ever found out—" "I know, Mama," George said softly. "I won't tell anyone, I promise." Marian was about to respond when a low groan drew her attention back to the Highland prisoner. His eyes fluttered open, clear blue now, no trace of the unsettling gold, and fixed on her face with confusion. He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing shoulder. His gaze moved from Marian to George, then around the unfamiliar cottage, his brow furrowing deeply. When he spoke, it was in rapid Gaelic, his tone questioning and wary. Marian caught the cadence of someone asking where and what, but the rest was lost to her. "Easy," Marian said softly. "You're safe. You were badly wounded, but—" The moment her hand touched his arm, his eyes snapped to her face with startling intensity. For a heartbeat, something flickered there. Then it was gone, replaced by wariness. What had she done? She had exposed them both, risked everything her family had worked to hide for generations. And for what? A Highland stranger who would probably run back to his clan the moment he could walk. Chapter 4. By evening, The Highlander had regained some strength. He sat propped against the hearth wall, no longer gray with fever but watchful. Marian found herself stealing glances at him, the way firelight played across his sharp features, how his blue eyes tracked her movements around the cottage. The wariness of the morning had been replaced by puzzled fascination as he looked at her, and Marian's cheeks warmed under his scrutiny. Worse, she nearly dropped the bowl of stew when their fingers brushed as she handed it to him. Her one consolation was that his eyes also widened slightly at the touch, and she wondered if he'd felt it too. That jolt of awareness she could not explain. He said something quietly, his voice a low rumble. "You're welcome," Marian replied, though she wasn't certain thank you was what he'd said. They tried to communicate through gestures and single words. He pointed to himself and said something that sounded like, "Ewan." She repeated it carefully, his name earning herself a devastating smile. Then, clearing her throat, she pointed to herself. "Marian." "Marian," he repeated, his accent wrapping around her name. George had been unusually quiet through the afternoon, often moving to peer out the shuttered windows. Now she stood at the small gap between the wooden slats, her body tense with concentration. "George, come away from there," Marian said. "Supper's ready." "I keep hearing things, Mama," George said without turning around. "Rustling, like something's moving in the woods." Marian frowned. Probably just a deer. The Highland stranger had gone very still at George's words. Even without understanding the language, he seemed to sense the tension. "I think," George's voice dropped to a whisper, "I think I saw a wolf." "That's impossible," Marian said immediately. "They avoid settlements." Ewan rose from his place, approaching the window. Standing beside George, he peered out into the growing darkness. For a long moment, he was completely motionless, his breathing so quiet Marian could barely hear it. Then he made a sound that froze her blood. It was low and rumbling, coming from deep in his chest. A growl. Marian and George stared at him in shock, but he seemed unaware of their attention. His focus was entirely on whatever he saw or sensed beyond the glass. Marian pressed closer to the window, following his gaze. At first, she saw only shadows and wind-tossed branches. Then something moved in the darkness between the trees. Something large and four-legged, then another, and another. "Heavens," Marian breathed, her hand finding George's shoulder. "There are more of them." The shadowy forms were retreating, melting back into the deeper forest. Beside her, Marian felt Ewan relax slightly. Then a sharp knock at the door made them all jump. "Marian!" Duncan's voice carried barely contained anger. "Open this door!" Marian's heart sank, but she had no choice. Duncan pushed past her the moment the door opened, his eyes scanning the cottage until they fixed on Ewan. "He's still alive." Duncan's voice was barely controlled. "Marian, what did you do?" "I'm a healer," Marian said carefully. "I did what I had to. You said yourself at the auction that he was dying." Duncan's eyes narrowed suspiciously. "Yet here he stands, whole and hale. What manner of healing is this?" Marian kept her face carefully blank. "I used my herbs and my knowledge." "Don't lie to me." Duncan stepped closer. "Don't you hear what people say about you, Marian? About the unnatural things?" "All right, you've seen that he's all better, so you can go now," George interrupted, stepping boldly between Duncan and her mother. His attention snapped to the girl, his expression darkening. "This child needs proper discipline," Duncan said, a firm hand to teach her respect. "George understands respect," Marian said sharply. "She is running wild," Duncan continued, moving toward George with clear intent. "Let me show you what a proper father would—" Ewan moved like lightning, flowing to his feet and placing himself directly between Duncan and George. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. Duncan's hand moved instinctively to his belt knife. Ewan's response was to bare his teeth. "You dare threaten an officer of the king's law," the sheriff seethed. Duncan drew his blade, but Ewan's hand shot out faster than thought, and suddenly Duncan was disarmed and backing toward the door with his own knife at his throat. "Enough!" Marian stepped between them. "Ewan, let him go. Duncan, he'll be gone by morning, I give you my word." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other with barely contained violence. Then Ewan stepped back, tossing the knife to clatter on the floor at Duncan's feet. "See that he is gone," Duncan said, his voice shaking with rage. "If I find him here come dawn, I'll have him arrested." He shot George one last dark look. "And we'll discuss this child's need for proper guidance very soon." The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. "You have to leave. Now," Marion said to Ewan, her heart still racing. The latter nodded, understanding clear in his eyes despite the language barrier. He gathered his few possessions and followed her to the door. "George, stay inside," Marion instructed. At the edge of the forest, where darkness pooled beneath the ancient trees, Marion stopped. She turned to face him, trying to find words in the common tongue that might make him understand. "You can't come back," she said, gesturing toward the trees. "The sheriff, Duncan, he'll hurt you if you do." Ewan stepped closer. Without a word, he reached for her hand, lifting it gently to his lips. The kiss was soft, reverent, burning against her knuckles. Marion felt her breath catch. "Thank you," he said in careful, accented English. The first English words she'd heard him speak. Then the trees around them rustled and Marion gasped. Wolves, massive and silver gray, were emerging from the shadows, not just one or two, but dozens, surrounding them in a loose circle. Marion stumbled backward, a scream caught in her throat, but Ewan stood calmly as the beasts padded forward, even giving them a brief nod. Then he turned to look at Marion, and in his gaze, she saw regret before he disappeared. The wolves melted away around him like mist, and Marion was alone at the tree line, her hand still tingling from his kiss. Chapter 5. The mist clung to everything, the jagged peaks, the heather-covered slopes, the ancient stones that jutted from the earth. Marion walked through it all, her bare feet finding purchase on ground that seemed to shift and change with each step. Pain coursed through her body with every movement, sharp and relentless, as if her very bones were trying to break free from her skin. She pressed forward anyway, drawn by something she couldn't name, deeper into the wild highland landscape that should have been foreign to her but felt achingly familiar. Through the swirling gray, she heard a low growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. And then golden eyes materialized in the mist ahead. A wolf, massive and silver gray. "Wait," she called out, her voice echoing strangely. But the creature began to lope away, always staying just beyond her reach. Marion followed. She had to reach it. Had to understand. Marion jolted awake, but not in her own cottage. She lay in a bed far grander than any she had ever known, and as she turned her head, her breath caught. Ewan was beside her, his arm wrapped protectively around her waist, his blue eyes filled with tenderness. "My heart," he murmured, his accent wrapping around words that she somehow understood perfectly now. "You were dreaming again." Relief flooded through her so powerfully it made her dizzy. "I thought you were gone," she whispered, "that I'd never see you again." "Never," he said, catching her hand. "I told you, my heart. You are mine as I am yours." My heart. The endearment sent warmth spiraling through her chest. "But it's been a month," she breathed. "A month of wondering, of hoping." "I'm here now," he said, rolling to face her fully. "I'll never leave you again." Marion melted into him, her body knowing his touch in ways her mind couldn't explain. And when he whispered against her throat in that musical Gaelic, calling her his mate, his heart, his very soul, she thought she might die from the perfection of it. "You belong to me," he growled softly, his teeth grazing the sensitive spot right where he had bitten her. "Say it, my heart. Say you're mine." Marion's eyes snapped open, this time for good. She was on the floor of her own cottage again, shivering in a cold sweat. Oh no, she thought, not again. She pressed her face to the rough wooden boards, trying to steady her breathing. For the past month, ever since the night Ewan left, Marion had been plagued by two things: the most vivid dreams of her life, and attacks of pain so severe they drove her to unconsciousness. The pain always started the same way, a deep ache in her bones, as if they were trying to reshape themselves. Then it would spread through her muscles, her joints, every fiber of her being until she felt as though she were being torn apart from the inside. She would inevitably collapse, only to wake hours later feeling perfectly fine. Nothing hurts, she told herself. Indeed, the pain was completely gone, as if it had never existed. And so she always thought, perhaps that was the last of it. Perhaps whatever illness this is has finally run its course. But even as she thought it, she knew she was lying to herself. The attacks were getting stronger, more frequent, and always, they were followed by those dreams. Dreams of mist and mountains and golden-eyed wolves. Dreams of Ewan holding her, touching her, calling her things that made her pulse race. Marian pushed herself to her feet, determinedly avoiding those particular memories. She had no time for such foolishness today. "George," she called as she moved to the wash basin. "Time to wake, sweetheart. Today is the day I meet with the King's Court. Remember what I told you?" "Aye," George replied. "You're to be questioned about your healing knowledge. Mama, do you think they suspect anything?" "Yes," Marian wanted to say. Duncan's suspicions had clearly reached royal ears, or she wouldn't have been summoned at all. "It will be fine," she said instead. "I'll tell them about grandmother's herb lore and be home by supper." George nodded, but Marian could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. They both knew what happened to women whose abilities were deemed unnatural. "Be careful, Mama." "Always am," Marian replied, leaning down to kiss her daughter's forehead. "Bar the door until I return. Don't let anyone in, no matter who they claim to be." The ride to the royal castle took most of the morning, giving Marian plenty of time to rehearse the careful half-truths she planned to tell about her healing knowledge. She would speak of herbs and poultices. She would not mention the warmth that sometimes flowed from her hands. The castle rose before her like something from a tale. As Marian presented the summons that had arrived 3 days ago, she tried to ignore the way her heart hammered against her ribs. "Just answer their questions," she told herself as a servant led her through corridors. "Tell them what they want to hear." The servant stopped before an ornate door carved with Scotland's royal arms. "The King's apothecary will see you now." Inside, glass vessels filled with strangely glowing liquids lined wooden shelves. The air hung thick with herbs and something acrid that burned her nose. "Ah, Mistress Marian," said a thin man in scholar's robes. "Please sit. I am Master Aldrich, the King's chief apothecary." He looked up, and Marian's blood chilled at the intelligence in his pale eyes. "I've heard fascinating reports about your abilities." Marian forced her voice steady. "I know something of herb lore, passed down from my grandmother." "Herb lore?" Master Aldrich smiled coldly. "Yes, that's what they all say, isn't it?" "I wouldn't know," she said carefully. "Come now." His tone sharpened. "Surely you're aware of what they call you, the witch woman who speaks to plants?" Marian's heart hammered. "People talk," she said. "Most of it is nonsense." Master Aldrich circled her chair. "Then perhaps you can explain how a Highland prisoner, dying from a poison that should have killed him within hours, made a miraculous recovery under your care?" he asked. Marian felt sweat bead on her forehead. "Sometimes the body heals itself," she attempted. "In one night?" His voice cracked like a whip. "A wound black with corruption, suddenly clean and healing?" Marian tried to calm her beating heart. "Please, Master, I don't know what you think I did, but I—" Unexpectedly, the apothecary began to laugh. "Oh, my dear woman," he said. "You don't have to be afraid. There's something I need to show you." He uncovered a table at the far end of the room. A Highland warrior lay there, his skin bearing the same silver-black corruption she had seen on... For one horrible moment, Marian thought it was him, Ewan. Then she saw the face, and felt relief so intense it made her dizzy. "Beautiful work, isn't it?" Master Aldrich stroked the corpse's arm. "Concentrated wolfsbane extract with certain alchemical enhancements. It killed that beast in hours." Marian stepped back. "How can you speak of a human being this way?" she gasped. "A human being?" Master Aldrich looked puzzled. "He wasn't a man. He was a beast, a wolf demon who refuses civilization. The king has decided if they won't bend the knee willingly, they'll be eradicated. And with my perfected formula, it will not be a problem." "You're talking about genocide," Marian protested, wondering what he meant by wolf demon. "I'm talking about pest control." The apothecary said, "Which brings me to why you're here. You found an antidote to my poison. I need to know how." Marian frowned. I don't understand, she protested. The Highland prisoner you healed had been infected with this exact formula, yet he lived. Master Aldrich's eyes glittered. If I know how to counteract my own poison, I can make it even more effective. I won't help you murder people, Marian said, backing away. Oh, but you will. Master Aldrich's smile turned predatory. You see, I already know you use something beyond normal herbs, something that leaves no physical trace but works nonetheless. The king is very interested in such talents. Marian's hand found the door handle behind her. Then I need supplies from the forest, she bluffed. Specific plants that don't grow in gardens. Of course you do, Master Aldrich called, and 2 guards stepped into the room. These men will escort you. Gather what you need, prepare your antidote, and return immediately. The king is eager to see a demonstration. In the forest, Marian walked between the guards, her mind racing with desperation when... Marian. She turned to see Duncan emerging from behind an oak, his sheriff's badge glinting in the sunlight. Sheriff Duncan, one guard said, Master Aldrich sent us to... I know what the master wants. He asked me to oversee this personally. You may return to the castle. But he said to bring her straight back. And you will, with me. The master trusts my judgment. After a moment's hesitation, the guards departed. I know what you're hiding, Duncan said quietly. You made no antidote to help that Highland savage. It was something else entirely. You told them about me, Marian whispered. Did you not think of George? George is exactly who I was thinking of. She needs proper education, discipline. Marian backed against a tree. You want to help her? Then leave us alone. I can help you both, Duncan said. The apothecary trusts me. Who do you think has been spreading his poison through the Highland territories? You? You've been murdering people? Marian seethed. I've been serving the crown's interests, and I can protect you from the consequences of your gifts, if you'll let me, Duncan said. Marian brows furrowed. How? She asked, wary. Duncan smirked. Marry me, he said. Our lands united, your reputation protected by my position. George would have a proper father, and you would have my protection. Never, Marian spat. You will. Duncan grabbed her arm. You will be my wife, and you will be grateful. Who else would have a witch for a bride? Suddenly, pain hit Marian like lightning. Her bones began to snap and reform, the agony overwhelming. Duncan released her in shock as she collapsed. What is happening? He stumbled back. A growl rose from the forest. Wolves emerged from the undergrowth, dozens of them, led by a massive silver-gray wolf with amber eyes. Sweet Mary, Duncan whispered, reaching for his sword. The pack attacked with precision. Through her agony, Marian saw the silver-gray wolf approaching, its golden eyes fixed on her with concern. The wolf from my dreams, she thought as darkness claimed her. The last thing she saw was the wolf's form beginning to shimmer and change, man and beast blurring together in the shadows of the Highland forest. Chapter 6. Marian woke to the sound of voices speaking in liquid Gaelic, the words flowing over her like water over stones. Her eyelids felt heavy as lead, but she forced them open to find herself staring at unfamiliar stone walls. This wasn't her cottage. Panic shot through her as memories flooded back. Duncan's attack, the wolves, the agony of her bones breaking and reshaping. She tried to sit up, gasping as pain lanced through her left arm. Easy, lass. A woman's voice, speaking accented Scots. You've been through quite an ordeal. Marian turned her head to see an elderly Highland woman sitting beside the bed, her weathered hands busy with some sort of herbal preparation. Where am I? She asked. Castle MacFarlane, the woman replied. I'm Morag, the clan's healer. Marian's mind reeled. A Highland castle? Why bring me here? She asked. The chief ordered it, Morag said simply. You've been unconscious for 2 days. The chief? Marian tried to process this information. Why would a Highland chief care about... Wait, 2 days? Marian interrupted herself as the full implications hit her. I have to go home. My daughter, George, is alone. She'll be terrified. Your wee one is here, Morag said quickly. Safe and well, I promise you. Before Marian could ask more, rapid Gaelic filled the room. Another woman had entered, younger, with the bearing of nobility. She spoke urgently to Morag, gesturing toward Marian with obvious agitation. "What is she saying?" Marian asked. "She's asking who bit you," Morag said carefully. Marian's frowned. "Who bit me?" she asked confused, until Morag pointed to her neck. "One of us did it, I can tell, and it is a crime among our kind," Morag said quietly. "A crime?" Marian stared at her. She wasn't sure if the woman's Scots was flawed or if she really meant what she said. "Such a bite should have killed you," Morag insisted. Marian shook her head. "A bite doesn't kill people," she argued. "That kind of bite does," Morag said grimly. Marian opened her mouth to answer, but then footsteps echoed in the corridor, and the younger woman said something sharp in Gaelic that made Morag's face went pale. "He comes," she whispered. "Who comes?" Marian asked. "The chief." Both Highland women suddenly straightened, their casual manner replaced by formal deference. "The chief?" Marian asked. "I doubt your chief is about to walk into my—" The door opened and Marian's breath caught in her throat as a tall figure entered. For a moment, she couldn't see his face clearly in the shadows of the doorway. This was clearly a man of importance, the way both women immediately bowed their heads. A Highland chief, as they claimed? Was he here to see her for reasons she couldn't fathom? But then the man stepped into the light, and Marian's world tilted. Eowyn, the Highland warrior she'd bought at auction, the man who'd kissed her hand and left with a pack of wolves, standing before her as the chief of Clan MacFarlane. "You're the chief," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You're their chief?" The man she'd thought was just another clansman, another warrior among many. The man she'd saved was one of the most powerful figures in the Highlands. Those winter blue eyes found hers across the room, and she saw him tense at her recognition, at the shock that must be written across her face. For a moment, Marian forgot the pain in her arm, forgot her confusion and fear. There was only Ewan, looking at her with an expression of such desperate relief that it made her chest tight. He crossed to her bedside slowly, as if she might vanish if he moved too quickly. When he reached her, he knelt beside the bed and carefully took her uninjured hand in both of his. "Thank you," Marian whispered, squeezing his fingers. "For the rescue. It was you, wasn't it? You came for me." He didn't understand her words, but something in her tone made his expression soften. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles, just as he had that night by the forest when he'd left her. Marian's cheeks warmed at the tender gesture. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged. But as he studied her face, his gaze drifted lower, and when his attention settled on her throat, his expression changed. Marian's hand flew instinctively to her neck, remembering how carefully she had arranged her hair to hide the marks that night he left. But now her hair was loose, offering no concealment. Ewan went very still, his face draining of color. He spoke a single word in Gaelic, a question, urgent and disbelieving. Marian didn't understand the word, but she understood the horror in his voice. He reached toward her throat with trembling fingers, then stopped himself, his hand falling to his side as if he didn't dare touch her. Morag stepped forward, speaking rapidly in Gaelic, her tone growing alarmed as she saw Ewan's expression. He responded sharply, and Marian heard her own name among the rapid words. "What is it?" Marian asked. "What's wrong?" Ewan turned to address Morag and the other woman, his tone sharp with authority, but underlaid with something that sounded like desperation. "He's asking who did this to you," Morag translated carefully. Marian's hand moved instinctively to her neck, and she saw Ewan's eyes track the movement. "Who did what?" she evaded. "The bite," Morag sighed. "He needs to know who marked you." Marian felt heat rise in her cheeks. Why does it matter?" Ewan spoke again, more sharply this time, and Marian flinched at his tone. Immediately, his expression softened. He spoke quickly to Morag, then reached toward Marian as if to comfort her before stopping himself. "He apologizes," Morag said. "He didn't mean to frighten you. But as I said, this is a grave crime among our people. Whoever did this to you will have to pay." Marian stared at Ewan, her fingers unconsciously tracing the faded marks on her throat. He must have seen the recognition in her face, because he went very still and spoke a single word in Gaelic, barely more than a whisper. He's asking if it was him, Morag said, her voice barely audible. The silence stretched between them, heavy with dread. Marion met Ewan's eyes and saw her answer reflected in his expression before she even spoke. "Yes," she whispered, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. Ewan's face crumpled as if she'd struck him. He staggered backward, pressing his hands to his face, and when he spoke, it was in rapid, anguished. "What is he saying?" Marion asked through her tears. He's saying he should have known, that he remembers fragments of that night, fevered dreams of—" Morag's cheeks reddened. Of claiming his mate. He thought it was delirium. Ewan sank to his knees beside her bed, reaching for her hand with trembling fingers. When she didn't pull away, he pressed her knuckles to his forehead, speaking in broken whispers. "He's asking for your forgiveness," Morag translated, "for doing this to you." "But I'm fine," Marion said, confusion mixing with her tears. "For now," Morag said grimly, "but such a bite, it should have killed you instantly. The fact that you've survived this long is a miracle. But make no mistake, child. Should you not complete your transformation, it will kill you." Chapter 7. 3 days had passed since Marion learned the truth about Ewan's bite, and each one had been worse than the last. George had adapted to the strange new world with the resilience of childhood, explaining how the wolves that had rescued her had transformed into men right before her eyes, how they'd been brought here for Marion's safety. "I wasn't afraid, Mama," George had insisted. "When the silver wolf looked at me, his eyes were kind, like he knew us." Marion found the concept harder to accept. These Highlanders could turn into wolves. The wolves she'd seen had been men. Ewan was one of them. And not only that, but she couldn't even ask him about it. Not just because they didn't speak the same language, but because he was never there. In those first hours after waking, Marion had expected him to visit. After all, he had risked everything to save her from Duncan and the king's men. Instead, he remained conspicuously absent. "Where is he?" she finally asked Morag on the second day. "The chief has many responsibilities," she answered carefully. Marion nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. But as the hours turned to days, that disappointment curdled into something sharper. When Ewan finally did appear, it was always briefly, always with others present. He would speak to Morag in rapid Gaelic, asking questions that clearly pertained to Marion's condition, but his eyes never met hers directly. The few times he addressed her directly, it was through Morag's translation, formal, distant inquiries about her comfort or needs. "Does he regret saving me?" Marion despaired on the third day. The thought stung more than it should have. But what had she expected? That a Highland chief would develop feelings for a lowland widow he'd known for mere days? She felt silly, and on top of that, there was something else troubling her, something physical that she couldn't ignore. A restlessness had begun to plague her, an ache that started in her chest and spread through her limbs. It wasn't the pain of her injuries. This was different, deeper. At first, she attributed it to her unfamiliar surroundings, to worry about their situation. But it grew stronger each day, becoming almost unbearable whenever Ewan was near. Her heart would race when she heard his voice in the corridor. Her skin would flush when he entered her chamber, and when he left, she felt such emptiness that it took her breath away. "What's wrong with me?" she wondered, pressing her hands to her chest as if she could physically contain the ache. Marion found herself listening for his footsteps, memorizing the cadence of his walk, the timbre of his voice when he spoke with others. And then there were the dreams. Strange, vivid dreams, where Ewan came to her chamber in the night, knelt beside her bed, and spoke to her in accented English she could somehow understand. Just dreams, she told herself upon waking, wishful thinking from a foolish woman. But the dreams felt more real than her waking hours. "What's happening to me?" she asked Morag on the fourth morning. "I can't sleep. I can't eat. There's this need inside me that I can't explain." Marion's cheeks burned with embarrassment. It's worse when he's near, when Ewan visits. Morag sat heavily in the chair beside Marion's bed. I was wondering when this would begin, she said. When what would begin? The bite, Morag said quietly. It was a claiming bite, you see. It creates complications. Marion's hand flew to her neck. What kind of complications? Among our people, a bite is sacred, Morag said. It's how mates claim each other, creating a bond that lasts lifetimes. But humans aren't meant to survive such a bite. The fact that you have suggests... Suggest what? That your body is trying to change, to become like us. Morag met Marion's eyes. And that ache you feel, the need for his presence, it's the incomplete bond calling to its other half. Marion stared at her. And him? She whispered. Does he feel it too? Morag hesitated. He believes he's doomed you with his mark, that your suffering is his fault. That evening, Marion lay awake, staring at the ceiling, Morag's words echoing in her mind. An incomplete bond. A change her body was fighting. Near midnight, her chamber door opened silently. Marion turned her head, expecting to see Morag with another herbal remedy. Instead, Ewan stood in the doorway. He approached her bed like a man walking to his execution, his face etched with pain. When he knelt beside her, Marion could see tears tracking down his cheeks. You came, she whispered. He spoke to her in Gaelic, words she couldn't understand, but that sounded like a confession, an apology, a prayer. His hands shook as he reached out to touch her face. I don't know what you're saying, Marion said, but she leaned into his touch anyway, starved for even this contact. Ewan's response was broken, anguished. He pressed his forehead to hers and continued speaking in his native tongue, and though she couldn't translate the words, she could hear the despair in them. When he finally left, slipping away as silently as he'd come, Marion found herself crying. The next morning, when she mentioned his visit to Morag, the older woman looked confused. The chief didn't leave his chambers last night, Morag said. The guards would have seen him. Marion's blood chilled. Had she dreamed it all? But she could still feel the echo of his touch on her skin, could still smell his scent lingering in her room. By the 5th day, Marion could barely leave her bed. The ache in her chest had become a constant companion. Your magic, Morag said finally. It's fighting the change. Your healing power keeps destroying the transformation before it can complete. Is that good or bad? Marion asked. The ancient healer's response was grim. Bad, Morag translated. Your magic is using all your life force to fight the change. If this continues, you'll die from the effort. Then what do I do? You must choose, the healer said. Stop fighting and let the change happen. But most humans die in the transformation. Or keep fighting until your magic fails and you die anyway. Marion stared at the two women. Those are my options. Die trying to transform or die fighting it. There's a small chance, Morag said reluctantly. Tonight is the blood moon. If you've truly made your choice, this is our best chance. Marion sat up. What does the moon have to do with it? The ancients discovered a ritual, Morag explained, to help witches who've been bitten. Marion opened her mouth to protest. I am no witch, she began, only a healer. Morag sent her a dubious look. If you weren't a witch, you'd most likely be dead. Your magic has kept you alive, and we celebrate magic here, child. She paused, as Marion let her shoulders sag. She'd never thought she'd meet people who'd celebrate the very thing she was always told to hide. The blood moon strengthens the wolf spirit, making the transition more survivable, Morag pursued. More survivable than 1 in 20? Marion asked bitterly. Morag's face softened. Perhaps 1 in 10 with the ritual. It's your only hope. Die fighting the change, or die attempting it, Marion thought. Either way, she would likely never see George grow up, never learn whether the dreams of Ewan's midnight visits were real or fantasy. But as the ache in Marion's chest intensified, as her breath grew shorter and her strength continued to ebb, she realized she was running out of time to make the choice at all. An hour later, she found herself in a circular chamber beneath the castle. At the center stood a weathered altar, its surface smooth from generations of use. When her daughter entered, Marian's composure nearly broke. George looked so small, so vulnerable amidst the strange symbols and shadowy chamber. "Mama?" Her voice trembled. "Are you really going to change?" Marian held her close. "I have to try, sweetheart, but if I don't survive, Morag will care for you. The clan has promised to protect you." When the door opened again, Marian expected Morag. Instead, Ewan stood in the doorway, his tall figure silhouetted against the torchlight. Marian's heart leapt, then plummeted as he entered with formal stiffness. He nodded to her but kept his distance, speaking briefly to the ancient healer in Gaelic. Marian fought down bitter disappointment. She had foolishly hoped he might offer comfort, perhaps even hold her hand through what could be her final moments. Instead, he stood rigid and watchful, present only because duty demanded it. The ancient healer approached with a ceremonial blade. "Your blood freely given," Morag translated, "to embrace the wolf within." Marian extended her palms. The blade bit into her flesh, her blood flowing into a stone bowl. "Now drink," Morag said. Marian hesitated, her eyes darting to Ewan. For the first time since entering, he looked directly at her, and the raw emotion in his gaze nearly undid her. Fear, guilt, and something deeper. Something that looked terrifyingly like goodbye. "He thinks I won't survive this," she realized. "He's already mourning me." With that knowledge burning in her chest, Marian drank. The liquid burned like fire down her throat, spreading through her veins like molten metal. Then the pain hit. Not the gradual ache of her previous attacks, but immediate, overwhelming agony that tore a scream from her throat. Her back arched off the altar as her bones began to break and reshape. Through the haze of torment, she heard voices shouting in alarm. But Marian's consciousness began to slip away, her life force draining with each tortured breath. She could feel herself dying, her magic, and the transformation tearing her apart from within. "Hold my hand," she wanted to beg Ewan. "Please, just hold my hand." As if hearing her thoughts, he pushed past the others to kneel beside her. His anguished face swam before her fading vision, his lips forming words she couldn't understand. She reached for him, desperate for one last touch, but her body would no longer obey her commands. Her consciousness slipped away. Chapter 8. Marian stood in a misty glen that felt familiar, though she'd never been there. "Ewan!" she called. He was walking ahead, away from her, toward a precipice that dropped into nothingness. She ran after him, catching his arm just as he reached the edge. "My heart," he breathed, turning to face her with wonder in his eyes. "In dreams we can speak truly, though I do not deserve the honor of your words." "What are you saying?" Marian asked, stunned as his face crumpled with anguish. "I've claimed you in madness when I was fevered, my beloved," he replied. "I couldn't resist the call of our bond, and now I've destroyed you." "Our bond," Marian whispered, the word carrying weight she was only beginning to understand. So Morag was right. They really did share a bond? "The bond recognized what my conscious mind couldn't see," Ewan explained, his voice breaking. "You were always meant to be mine, as I was meant to be yours. That's why I bit you, why my wolf claimed you despite my human will. You were my destined mate, and I poisoned you with my love." "You did no such thing," Marian protested, for his love certainly did not feel like poison, but rather like relief and rightness. "Look how you fade," he protested. "What kind of man kills the woman he loves with his very touch? I cannot exist in a world where your light has been extinguished by my darkness. The bond that should have blessed us has become your death sentence." He pressed his hands to her face. "I've avoided you these 3 days to give a fighting chance. I thought, freed from our bond, your magic would perhaps be enough to save you. But I cannot let you die alone. I'll be with you soon, my heart, if you'll have me." Something cold settled in Marian's stomach. "What do you mean you'll be with me soon?" "In whatever realm awaits beyond, perhaps I can beg your forgiveness across eternity," Ewan said, and horror flooded Marian. He looked back at her one last time, his face ravaged by despair. "I love you, my heart. I'll never leave you again." And then, before Marion could stop it, he stepped backward into the void. Marion's eyes snapped open to gasps and exclamations. She was surrounded by tear-streaked faces: George, Morag, the ancient healer, and several Highland warriors all staring at her as if she'd risen from the dead. "Mama!" George threw herself into Marion's arms, sobbing. "We thought you were gone. You weren't breathing. Your heart stopped." "I'm here," Marion said weakly. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she searched the faces around her. Ewan was nowhere to be seen. "Where is he?" The question tore from her throat. Her dream, the memory of Ewan's anguished face, his promises to follow her into death. Please let it have been just a dream. The warriors exchanged dark looks. One spoke in Gaelic, his tone heavy with finality. Marion's blood turned to ice. "They've taken him to the sacred grove," Morag translated, her voice breaking, "for execution, on his orders." A scream tore from Marion's throat. The dream hadn't been a dream at all. It had been real. Ewan's goodbye, his promise to follow her into death, his step into the void, he meant it. Marion struggled to sit up, desperation and newfound strength surging through her transformed body. "How far? Can we reach them?" "It's too late," Morag said sadly. They left at dawn for the grove of the first wolves. It's half a day's ride, and by ancient law, no one may interfere once the ritual begins. Marion felt a primal growl building in her chest. "I am not no one," she said. She pushed herself out of bed, ignoring George's protests and Morag's warnings. Her legs shook beneath her, but she forced herself toward the door. "Marion, you're too weak," Morag began. "He's going to die thinking I'm dead," Marion said fiercely. "I won't let that happen." She stumbled from the chamber and down the castle corridors, her bare feet slapping against cold stone. Every step was agony. Her body felt like it had been torn apart and badly reassembled. The magical exhaustion from her failed transformation hung over her like a shroud. "I'm not fast enough. I'm not strong enough." Marion burst from the castle into the Highland morning, gasping at the shock of cold air. The sacred grove was miles away through rough terrain. In her current state, barely able to walk without swaying, she'd never make it in time. But she had to try. She began to run, or what passed for running with her unsteady legs. Within minutes, she was stumbling, falling to her knees on the rocky path, her body betraying her desperate will. "Get up," she forced herself to her feet. "Get up and run." Behind her, she could hear voices calling. Morag, George, the warriors. But she didn't turn back. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs gave out again, got up and ran some more. "I'm too late. I'm too weak. He's going to die." Marion felt tears streaming down her face as she forced her failing body forward. Every stumble, every fall, every moment of weakness was another second lost. I love him, and I'm going to lose him because I'm not strong enough." Marion tried to push herself up and collapsed again. Her magic-drained body simply had nothing left to give. She lay there on the Highland earth, gasping and broken, feeling Ewan's pain through their bond and knowing she had failed. "No." The word blazed through her mind with desperate fury. "No, I will not let him die." Something shifted deep inside her. Not her magic this time, but something else entirely. The wolf spirit that had been fighting for dominance, waiting for her to stop resisting. "Let go," she told herself. "Stop fighting, let it happen." Pain exploded through her body as bones cracked and reformed, but she gritted her teeth and held on. Her spine elongated, muscles tearing and rebuilding, but instead of unconsciousness, there was power. Wild, primal, magnificent power flowing through her transformed form. When the agony faded, Marion stood on 4 legs with silver-white fur and golden eyes that could see for miles. The transformation felt as natural as breathing, as if this had always been her true form. Without another thought, she bounded across the Highland landscape, covering ground that would have taken a horse hours in mere minutes. Her new senses guided her. The scent trail of the pack, the pull of the bond that connected her to Ewan's heart, and the desperate need to reach him before it was too late. The sacred grove called to something ancient in her blood, and she followed that call through forest and glen until she burst into a clearing where ancient stones stood in a circle. The pack was there, dozens of wolves surrounding a raised stone altar. And on that altar, Yuan knelt in human form, his head bowed in acceptance as an ancient elder of the pack approached with a silver axe. Marian shifted back to human form without conscious thought, her voice carrying across the grove with supernatural power. "Stop!" The ancient elder snarled, but Yuan's eyes widened in shock. "She lives," someone whispered in her tongue. "The human lives." Marian walked into the circle, and the pack parted before her like water. She had eyes only for Yuan, who stared at her as if she were a vision. "I'm here," Marian told him, even though he probably didn't understand. Not that it matters. Tears streamed down his face as he reached for her, his hands trembling as they cupped her cheeks. He spoke again in his own tongue, words that sounded like prayers or pleas. Marian didn't understand, but her new wolf senses could smell his scent, could hear his heartbeat, and so her gaze fixed on his throat, where she could see his pulse beating beneath his pale skin. The wolf in her recognized him, her mate, her other half. Yuan's eyes met hers, and then his head tilted back, baring his throat in the ancient gesture of invitation. No words were needed. This was older than language, deeper than human understanding. Wolf calling to wolf, mate to mate. Marian moved on pure instinct to breathe in his scent. She could smell his fear, his love, his desperate hope, all of it mixing into something that made her wolf spirit sing with recognition. When her teeth found the spot where his neck met his shoulder, it wasn't gentle or hesitant. She bit down with supernatural strength, tasting copper and magic and the wild essence that made him hers. Yuan's body arched beneath her, a sound escaping him that was half human groan, half wolf howl. The moment her teeth pierced his skin, the world exploded into sensation so intense it bordered on violence. Their minds crashed together, not the gentle touching of souls she'd imagined, but a collision of two fierce spirits recognizing their other half. His emotions flooded through her, relief so profound it was painful, love so desperate it burned, and beneath it all, the wild joy of a wolf finally reunited with his mate. Mine. Her consciousness snarled possessively as his life force poured into her. Yours, came his fierce response, carrying with it 1,000 unspoken promises. The bond is complete, the ancient elder said in wonder. She lives, the first human to survive the claiming in centuries. Marian looked into Yuan's eyes and saw her own fierce joy reflected there. They were no longer two separate beings. They were mated wolves, bound by magic older than civilization. The pack around them cheered in celebration of a miracle. Their alpha had found his true mate, and she had proven strong enough to survive the claiming. In that moment, surrounded by the wild music of her new family, Marian understood she had found where she truly belonged. Not in the civilized world that had feared her gifts, but here in the ancient places where magic ran free and love could transcend the boundaries between human and wolf. She was home at last. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the story. If you'd like to listen on the go, all my stories are also available on Spotify under my name, Lily's Romance Library. You'll find the link in the description below. A big thank you to everyone who's following. Your support truly means the world to me.